Releasing an animal into the wild can feel like an act of kindness. Open the cage, empty the tank, and let it go free. But sometimes, that single moment can start a disaster that lasts for decades. Because an animal that seems harmless in your home can become something completely different once it enters an ecosystem that was never prepared for it. Welcome back to Wild Unknown. Today we're counting down 7 animals you should never release into the wild. Some can multiply incredibly fast. Others can push native wildlife out of entire habitats. And one of them has already transformed parts of America in ways almost nobody expected. A goldfish seems like one of the safest animals you could possibly release. After all, it's just a fish. What could really happen if you emptied that little aquarium into a pond? The answer can be surprisingly ugly. Once released into suitable fresh water, goldfish can survive far better than many owners expect. And outside the limits of a small tank, they may grow dramatically larger. But size isn't the real problem. Goldfish feed along the bottom, stirring up sediment as they search for food. That disturbance can cloud the water, affect aquatic plants, and change habitat conditions for native species. They can also compete with native fish for resources. And if enough released or escaped goldfish establish themselves, that innocent-looking pet can become part of a much larger ecological problem. That's the strange thing about releasing pets. To the owner, it can feel like freedom. To the ecosystem, it can be an introduction it never asked for. One fish disappears beneath the surface, and the person walks away believing they did something kind. But the consequences may continue long after they're gone. And if a goldfish can cause trouble simply by surviving, Number 6 brings another advantage into the wild: a shell, a powerful appetite, and an incredible ability to adapt. A tiny turtle can look almost impossible to fear. It moves slowly. It spends hours sitting quietly under a light. And when owners can no longer care for one, releasing it into a local pond may seem like the most humane choice. But for a red-eared slider, that pond can become a new home. And that's where the problem begins. These turtles are tough, adaptable, and capable of surviving in environments far beyond the places where they naturally belong. Once established, they can compete with native turtles for food, basking areas, and other limited resources. And unlike the tiny turtle someone once carried home, an adult red-eared slider can become much larger and live for decades. That's one reason unwanted pet turtles create such a difficult problem. Releasing one doesn't make the responsibility disappear. It simply transfers that responsibility to the ecosystem. The turtle may survive. Then another is released. Then another. Eventually, what began as a few unwanted pets can become a permanent population. And that's the danger hiding behind a seemingly compassionate decision. Sometimes setting an animal free isn't rescue. It's an introduction. But number 5 raises the stakes in a completely different way, because this next animal doesn't need decades to become a problem. Give it enough food and enough time, and a few can become many surprisingly fast. A rabbit doesn't look like an ecological threat. It looks like the exact opposite. Soft fur, long ears, a nervous little animal that seems more likely to become someone else's dinner than destroy anything around it. But release rabbits into the right environment, and that image can change quickly. Rabbits are built to reproduce. When food is plentiful, predators are limited, and the climate works in their favor, a small population can expand surprisingly fast. And every new rabbit needs to eat. They graze on grasses, seedlings, and young plants. They can strip vegetation, damage crops, and compete with native animals for food and shelter. The problem becomes especially serious in places where rabbits were never part of the original ecosystem. Australia learned this lesson on an enormous scale. European rabbits introduced there spread across huge areas and became one of the country's most notorious invasive animals. And it all reveals something uncomfortable about releasing pets. An animal doesn't have to be aggressive to cause damage. It doesn't need claws. It doesn't need venom. Sometimes, it just needs to survive, eat, and reproduce. But number 4 makes this story much more personal, because this animal may already be sleeping on someone's couch tonight, and once it begins hunting outside, the victims may never even see it coming. A house cat can spend the morning asleep on a couch and become a hunter the moment it steps outside. That's what makes this animal so different from everything we've seen so far. Cats don't need to be starving to hunt. The instinct can remain even when they're well fed. A movement in the grass, a bird landing nearby, a small animal running beneath a bush, and suddenly the quiet pet from your living room becomes a predator. Now imagine that cat isn't simply allowed outside. Imagine it's abandoned completely. If it survives, it may join other free-ranging cats, reproduce, and contribute to populations that can place pressure on native wildlife. Birds, reptiles, and small mammals can all become prey. And on islands or in ecosystems containing vulnerable native species, that pressure can be especially serious. This is what makes releasing a domestic cat so dangerous. You're not simply giving a pet its freedom, you're placing an efficient predator into an environment that may already be struggling to protect its smallest animals, and the cat itself may suffer too. Life outdoors brings traffic, disease, fights, hunger, weather, and countless other dangers that didn't exist inside a home. So if someone can no longer care for a cat, abandoning it outdoors isn't a second chance. It's a gamble, for the cat and for everything living around it. But number 3 doesn't quietly hunt through the grass. It's larger, stronger, and once enough of them establish themselves, they can physically reshape the land beneath their feet. A pig escaping into the wild doesn't sound like the beginning of an invasion. But give that pig enough time, and it can become something very different from the animal people imagine behind a farm fence. Feral pigs are powerful, adaptable, and remarkably good at finding food. They root through soil with their snouts, tearing apart vegetation as they search for roots, insects, and anything else they can eat. And when groups of them move through an area, the landscape can look completely different afterward. Soil is disturbed, plants are destroyed, crops can be damaged, and native animals may suddenly find their habitat turned upside down. But the damage isn't limited to the ground. Feral pigs are opportunistic omnivores. That means they'll eat far more than plants, including small animals and eggs when the opportunity appears. And once a population becomes established, controlling it can become extremely difficult. That's what makes releasing domestic pigs, or allowing them to escape, so different from simply losing livestock. The animal doesn't necessarily disappear into the wilderness. It can adapt to it. And over generations, those descendants can become part of a problem far larger than the original owner ever imagined. One animal behind a fence looks manageable. A growing population hidden across forests, fields, and wetlands, that's something else entirely. But number 2 became infamous for almost the opposite reason. It doesn't tear up the landscape, it disappears into it. And in Florida, that ability helped turn an exotic pet into one of the most recognizable invasive predators in America. A Burmese python doesn't need to chase its prey across an open field. It has a much more effective strategy: disappear. In the wetlands of South Florida, dense vegetation and warm conditions can make a large snake surprisingly difficult to spot. And that's part of what makes this story so unsettling. Burmese pythons are native to Asia, but after being brought into the United States through the exotic pet trade, some escaped or were released. Eventually, breeding populations became established in South Florida. Once there, they found something every invasive predator needs: food, rabbits, raccoons, opossums, birds, and other animals that had evolved without a giant constrictor hiding nearby. A python doesn't need venom. It ambushes prey, coils around it, and uses constriction to overpower it. And because these snakes can grow extremely large, the list of potential prey expands with them. But perhaps the most frightening part isn't the size of the snake. It's how difficult the problem becomes once thousands of acres of wetland provide places to hide. Removing a few animals is one thing. Finding an established population spread across a vast ecosystem is something entirely different. That's why releasing an exotic predator isn't simply about whether one animal survives. It's about what happens if that animal finds another of its kind. And the wilderness gives them everything they need. But our number one animal proves an invasive predator doesn't need to be enormous. It doesn't even need to live on land. Sometimes the most destructive invasion begins with something beautiful enough to put inside an aquarium. Lionfish look almost too beautiful to be dangerous. Striped bodies, wide fan-like fins, long venomous spines that make them look more like underwater decorations than invasive predators. And that's exactly what made them so attractive in the aquarium trade. But once lionfish appeared in Atlantic and Caribbean waters, beauty became part of a much darker story. These fish are efficient hunters. They can hover near reefs, approach smaller fish, and strike before their prey has much chance to react. And in ecosystems where native species didn't evolve alongside them, lionfish gained an enormous advantage. They consume small fish and crustaceans, including species that play important roles in reef communities. They also reproduce effectively and have spread across a huge marine range. And unlike an invasive animal trapped on an island or inside a lake, the ocean doesn't come with fences. Once a marine species becomes established across reefs and coastlines, stopping its spread becomes extraordinarily difficult. That's why releasing an aquarium fish isn't simply giving it a larger tank. You're opening a door between two completely different worlds. And once that door opens, you may never be able to close it again. The lionfish is beautiful. It's fascinating. And in the right aquarium, it's exactly where it belongs. But released into the wrong ocean, beauty can become an invasion. So if there's one lesson behind every animal on this list, it's simple. Never assume releasing a pet means setting it free. A goldfish can change a pond. A rabbit can become part of a growing population. A cat can return to its instincts as a predator. And animals like Burmese pythons and lionfish show what can happen when an introduced species finds exactly what it needs to survive. Sometimes the kindest choice isn't opening the cage or emptying the aquarium. It's finding a responsible new home. Which animal on this list surprised you the most? Tell us in the comments. And subscribe to Wild Unknown for more incredible stories from the animal world. Because in nature, one small decision can leave a footprint far bigger than anyone expected.